Ridegear Guybrave 2. Riding Gears and Braving Guys Boogaloo. This is the sequel to the original Ridegear Guybrave and the only sequel ever made by Avit, the company that only made like 5 games and no one's ever heard of them, but they made this and the predecessor, and it being the only sequel, they must have really believed in this IP to go out of its way to do so. I have previously talked about the original Ridegear Guybrave. It was a quirky little import, sort of half beat-em-up, half RPG kind of budget title, but it was a pretty fun little import, provided you could get past 1 or 2 tricky bits if you didn't understand the language. And this one feels pretty much better in every way, but it also feels like a completely different game. And that in and of itself makes it even more interesting than the fact that it's already an interesting, weird, kind of quirky Japanese game no one's ever heard of by a company that only made like 5 games. Now the story itself, from what I can tell, follows directly after the original game. Momo-chan is back, and it sort of follows the latter half of the plot from the original game, which seemed to, from what I could discern, involve Martians coming to the Erath to try and steal some kind of energy source, I think. The game more or less just picks up after that. The weird thing about this game, however, is while it has more cutscenes than the original game, the story itself is somewhat harder to follow than the initial one, just by virtue that while this game does feature more cutscenes, it features more and more story being delivered through static backgrounds and character stills, which means if you're working through this by understanding contextual stuff like I normally do, it's a lot harder to figure out. Although that said, I did figure out the weird subplot involving our blue-haired stallion and saving this one woman in his own personal quest. That was kind of neat. It was kind of neat that the characters got their own like unique personal backstory quest. It was cool. But the main story itself is a lot harder to get into if you don't understand the language, so that is something to be aware of. But on the flip side, I think this game is infinitely more playable if you don't understand the language, because it doesn't involve all the minutia and like walling off that the latter half of the previous game did. For those of you who haven't seen my review of the previous one, go do that, but the short version is that was a 2D beat 'em up where you had to sort of traverse the entire world, and then when you got to the end, you got like this invisible barrier that required you to like walk all the way back and have a conversation at the first town, only to go all the way back and do that again. This game, it's a lot easier because there's no traversing the world. You just go to the command center of your base and say, I want to do the next mission. And boom, doing the next mission. That's a lot easier, and the fact that it doesn't involve, walking from point A to point B over and over and over again means that this game has a much quicker flow and it's a much better paced game. But it's also a completely different game. Yeah. The first game was an RPG kind of tied with a beat 'em up. This one, third-person rail shooter mixed with like virtual on or like super diet store brand gacha force. That's awesome! Okay, so you pick your mech of choice, and what's really interesting is in this game, they all level collectively, so you don't have to level each mech individually, and they actually have functionally very different stats, which is pretty cool. You then get dropped into your little area where you are forced to scroll through this area and pick off enemies as they head towards you, and at the end you are forced to fight a boss in like a third-person arena-style fighting shooter thing. It's very much like a diet virtual on or gacha force, which is pretty cool in that regard. And combining that with like the weird sort of almost Star Fox nature of the initial bits, it's definitely a fun little combination of things. It's very action-packed and it's really easy to get into. I will say that I'm not a big fan of the rail shooter aspect of it, just by virtue of the fact that the latter halves of the 3D combat areas take place in very small arenas, but it just feels a lot better to have the ability to move pretty much in any direction you want, whereas in the scrolling bits to each stage, while in some stages you can go back a little bit, you always have like this invisible wall of you can't get past here and we're going to constantly scroll forward, so you better keep moving. Unfortunately, this means that if you're targeting every enemy in the stage, some will slip past you and they're just gone forever, which is equally insulting because at the end of each stage they'll actually give you a percentage rate of how many enemies you took down, and knowing that it wouldn't be too hard to take out every single one of them, provided, I didn't have to deal with that auto-scrolling invisible wall behind me, it's a little annoying. Not a big deal, though. Like the previous game, you can outfit your mech with 3 different ranged weapons, as well as a melee weapon, as well as a secondary ranged weapon for your hand So this time we're not dealing with some sort of weird octo-mech that utilizes like 3 of every weapon, even though there's no real reason to. However, in this game, your weapon loadouts actually make a little bit more sense. Like I said, you only have to equip 1 melee weapon, so just equip the best thing you've got. Same with your handgun. But the thing is, they take different forms. You can have like a bazooka type thing, and that fires a lot slower, so there is a little bit of strategy based on what you have instead of just picking the thing that has the biggest stats. And of course, shoulders are very similar to the previous game. You've got 3 and each one has their own dedicated energy pack. However, you can't swap them mid-combat anymore. So you have to go in with a loadout plan. But they do behave slightly differently, so there is actually a reason in this game to swap between different stuff and experiment with your loadouts. They actually took the issue I had with the previous game, which was, you have so many different pieces of equipment you can have on you at one time, but there's no reason to, and they actually gave a reason to. They actually sort of wanted to develop their game a little bit further, mechanically speaking, and think about what they were doing. That's fantastic. There's even like a sub-armor and like booster sort of thing where you can equip yourself different armor plating, different speed reaction type, module type things, as well as other different things that sort of boost your stats on the back end. And the neat thing is that, like the previous game, they all show you the basic stats, so you can kind of figure it out without being able to read. Unfortunately, the menus in this game are a lot less English friendly than the previous game, but it's not too much of an issue. It's mostly just sort of navigating your base being the biggest offender to this. So, after a few missions, you got this. Now, as great as the loadouts and equipment and how much of an upgrade that is from the previous game, there is a bit of a drawback to this, and it actually comes to one of the biggest compliments I have from this game over the original, which is it doesn't have any of that walking around going between towns wasting a whole lot of time minutia nonsense. Unfortunately, because it removed that aspect from this game, there is no longer the ability to just walk to the next town, peruse their equipment, and buy the best stuff. Indeed, there's not really much of a shop system at all in this game. If you want equipment, it's all from drops from enemies, which means, the more you play, the better stuff you get, right? Well, here's where things are a bit of an issue. See, drops in this game seem to be pretty much entirely random, and I don't just mean necessarily the sense that it's random whether or not an enemy will drop something, so much as it's random if they will drop something, but also it's random what they drop. And I noticed this because the first pieces of equipment I got were alright, and then after that, everything I got was significantly worse than my first drops. Like, it took several missions before I found anything that came close to my first drops. Like, it just randomly decided, hey, we're gonna give this guy an awesome super drill that's better than, like, the next 10 levels of weapons, and, like, a bazooka, and, like, these crazy missile launchers. No problem, no problem. Hey, that's a super-powered speed upgrade, let's give it to him. And then every other drop I got after this, and the drops are really, really few and far between in this game, they were just nowhere near as good as what I already had, which is a bit of a problem, because it means that this game effectively has, outside of its basic RPG experience leveling system, basically zero sense of progression at all, and it feels like, well, I'm not getting stronger, my mech isn't getting any more badass, and also, in situations like this where you have a game that involves a lot of equipment swapping and stuff, it's really fun to experiment and augment and see what you have that's best, and it's always fun to see what that flashy new toy you just got was, but if everything's effectively worse than what you already have, or it's just completely random, there's no guarantee what you get is going to be better, and there's no real sense to actually, like, experiment with it because it's just not good. You lose that entire sense of wonder and awe and excitement of, oh, I just got this fancy new thing, because there's a good chance it's not as good as what you already have, and it makes you almost wonder why you bother. The gameplay itself is fantastic, but the drop system needs a massive overhaul in this game because it's not only underwhelming, it's almost punishing to even try to go out of your way to get drops. And I think the most insulting thing about this is drops on the field are labeled as treasure, which, to me sounds like, oh, it's gonna be like this super awesome thing, only to realize it's a thing that's like made out of rusty junk that's falling apart, and I might as well just throw it in the bin. It's frustrating to see a game that has made so many strides to make itself better, make itself stand out, make itself more interesting from its previous iteration, which was already somewhat interesting in a budget sense, and then it takes one of its greatest strengths, which is, how cool all these different items are, and basically throw that in the garbage. It almost feels like it's losing a little bit of its own identity in that regard, which is a real damn shame. The gameplay itself otherwise is, not very different from the original game, as weird as that sounds, given that it's a completely different genre. You use the triangle button to fire off one weapon, you use the square to fire off the other. You jump with X, although you never really need it. And when you get close to enemies, it'll contextually understand that. Instead of using your handgun, it'll swap to your melee weapon. Again, very virtual on Gotcha Force. Kind of appreciate that. It's nice, and it understands that context very, very well. It's not a very glitchy or buggy system. It's actually quite a solid combat system. It's not the most fantastic or stand out, but it's certainly competent, and it works, and it's enjoyable. And of course, as an import, I have to look at how this is, you know, if you can't understand a lick of Japanese like me. And overall, it works out pretty well. You know, you won't be able to understand much of the story, if any whatsoever, again, because there's not so much context as given in the actual game itself anymore, as this game does seem to favor very, very short static images to tell its story. But, you know, from the gameplay perspective, it's a lot easier to get into and a lot more fun. There's a little bit of menuing issues, but you can get past that pretty well. There is one quality issue I ran into, and I'm not sure if it's this particular game or my PS2 or whatever, but early on in the game, you start out in like this crappy little dome base that you were in the first game. And you have this like weird static screen mech boarding sequence between levels, and every time I got into one of these to start a level, 70% of the time the game would actually crash. But the weird thing is, I'm inclined to think that this part of the game just wasn't bug tested very, very well, because after the third level, you get this giant spaceship that's like your new base, and you get like a proper mech boarding sequence that's actually animated and looks awesome. And that works perfectly fine. So yeah, it's just the weird short one in the intro that they couldn't be bothered to animate because they only used it 2 or 3 times, and that one is just weirdly buggy. So you might have to save scum a little for like the first 2 or 3 missions, but after that the game runs pretty well. Gameplay is fantastic, although the drops could be a lot more generous and it could have a better sense of progression. But otherwise, it's a pretty fun little shooter if you can get it for a decent price. Not fantastic, mind you, but again, the original Ridegear Guybrave was very much a budget title. I would say this one's got a bit more of a budget, and I feel like they actively tried to improve what the original tried to be, and in many ways they succeeded, except for the equipment. That's the one thing. But overall, it's a pretty good game, gameplay-wise. In terms of presentation, Ridegear Guybrave 2 knocks it out of the park. Visually, I think it's pretty much an upgrade of the original, maybe marginally. The mechs themselves seem to be a little less chibi and a little bit more real robot, which that's a visual style thing that might bug some people. For me, I think I kind of preferred it, although they are still fairly chibi. And while I don't care for the static images, they look decent enough. The animated cutscenes look pretty damn solid, but here's where the game really kicks it up a notch. The soundtrack to this game. The soundtrack to this game absolutely slaps, and it's way better than a budget title like this has any right to be. I also have to give a massive shout out to JetWolf68K for allowing me to use his recorded version of the soundtrack to save me some time. Also, you should go check out his channel. He's got like full archive of this soundtrack on his channel. Go check it out. It's a fantastic soundtrack. Also, he sent the game to the show, so he's awesome, and you got to give him a big thanks from me. But overall, presentation-wise, this game is definitely a step up from the first one visually, but the soundtrack, the first game was okay. It was pretty bloody generic, and they reused like the same 4 songs over and over again, but it was okay. Here, it's way better than it has any right to be. I love the soundtrack to this game. It is unbelievably kick-ass. Now, if you want a copy of Ridegear Guybrave II on the PS1, the cheapest copy you're going to get right now, $35, shipping included, which is a little bit less expensive than I remember it being when I first looked it up years ago. I remember it being like $45, $50. I think this game is a little less common than the original Ridegear Guybrave, and to be fair, I think it's a lot better. I think both games are pretty fantastic if you're looking to add games to your collection, but while the first game is a game I would say you should add to your collection to just expand it and have something playable that might be fun for a bit, I think this game might actually be worth going out of your way for. Again, it's not the highest profile game ever, and I think it's still pretty budgety, but if you can get past like the weapon progression being pretty jank, it's a pretty solid little shooter with a fantastic soundtrack, and you know, it's a great little mech game. I'm kind of surprised I hadn't heard of this game before someone had to tell me it even existed, and hell, it's way better than the first game. You know, at the end of the day, I kind of wish Yvette had stuck around and made more Ridegear Guybraves. The difference in quality from the first to the second game is leaps and bounds. I think this game is way way better than the first game, and I can pretty wholeheartedly recommend it. It's a solid little game, and you know, it's honestly a game I can't really say I've seen anything quite like. I could say the rail shooter sections are kind of like Diet Landmaster from Star Fox 64, which honestly I think this is better than Landmaster. Landmaster was awful. And I could say that, you know, the fighting is definitely Diet Gotcha Force meets Virtua On, but, you know, mixing those two things together, throwing in a kick-ass soundtrack, and of course, 4 different mechs of your choice, huge range of weapons, albeit it's hit or miss whether or not you actually get anything fun, you know, it's pretty solid. I think $35 might be a tad expensive, but, you know, whereas the first game, I would say maybe if you really want to buy the first one, maybe $15. I think this one for $25 is, you know, I think that's pretty respectable. Again, provided that you're willing to go in and understand that this one is definitely sort of a budget experience. It's definitely a lot more solid than the first game, and I had an absolute blast with this game. Again, huge shoutouts to JetWolf68K for sending this to the show, along with a box of other stuff. The next game I'm going to do is something else from someone else, but after that we're going to get back to his box of awesome. Go check out his awesome music archive from games to find other soundtracks, including Ridegear Guybrave. Just listen to the soundtrack to this game, it's awesome. But again, big thank you to JetWolf, and you know, this game is pretty damn fun, and honestly, I really appreciate him telling me about it. I really appreciate him sending it to me, because honestly, if he hadn't, I wouldn't know this exists, and you know, that would be a shame, because this game, I think it deserves a lot more credit than it gets. It's a pretty damn good import.